everyone, welcome back to another science fair lesson. Today we're going to be going over how to write your purpose, hypothesis, and a formal materials list. For your opener, and again, your space to write should be in your copy of the notes packet, is to write, how are you feeling about science fair so far? Go ahead and pause this video, take a minute to write down what you are thinking, and then take an additional minute to share with a partner or someone sitting near you. Your objective for today's lesson is I can write a purpose, hypothesis, and materials list for my science fair experiment. Let's go over some directions. Today you will be writing a purpose statement, a hypothesis, and a materials list for your science fair project. Each of these parts has different requirements. You will eventually be working with your groups if you have one, but wait until work time starts to move to sit with them. We learned yesterday that your testable question is how you start an experiment, even though it does not go in your final presentation. Please make sure a copy of your testable question is out and available for you to use during this lesson. This can be a copy from your notes from last week, or pulling it up in another tab, something so that you can see it as you're writing today. Let's start with the purpose statement. A purpose statement is a sentence that shows what the goal of your experiment is. It should start with, the purpose of this experiment is to determine, or the purpose of this experiment is to figure out. It should basically be restating your testable question in sentence form. This is kind of something that's new for most middle school students, but it's definitely going to be a requirement for you in high school and college. So when you're younger and you're doing an experiment in earlier grades, you might start with that testable question, but a purpose statement is seen as more formal, and if you ever submit a formal lab report, you will have to have a purpose statement. It's basically just telling your reader what you're trying to accomplish by doing the experiment. Kind of like having an objective at the beginning of class if your school uses those. Let's go over an example. If your testable question was, which type of marker, permanent or washable, bleeds the most when in contact with water? An example of a purpose statement would be, the purpose of this experiment is to determine whether permanent or washable markers bleed more when in contact with water. So all I did was rephrase that testable question into a statement form. That statement then tells my reader what I'm trying to do during this experiment and what information I'm trying to find. Let's move on to hypothesis. A hypothesis is a statement that shows your prediction for the outcome of the experiment. It should start with I think or I believe. It should not be a question, but it should answer your testable question. So this is just going to be your prediction for what you think is going to happen during the experiment, and that kind of tells your reader ahead of time what you were expecting to happen during the experiment. Let's go over an example. If your testable question was, which color t-shirts traps the most heat from sunlight? An example of a hypothesis would be, I believe that the purple t-shirt will trap the most heat from sunlight. This tells your reader exactly what you thought was going to happen during the experiment. Another important thing to remember about your hypothesis is at the end of doing your experiment or the end of your science fair project, it doesn't really matter if you were right or wrong. When we do an experiment, the point is that you learned something from it and you gained more information, even if your hypothesis was incorrect. Let's go over materials list again. You already wrote a draft of your materials list last week to help your teacher order supplies, but now it's time to make an official one. Your final materials list should include everything you possibly need for your experiment in a single list. You can use last week's materials list to help you get started. One important thing to remember about your materials list is to make sure it's really clear and it's very easy to tell what each item is supposed to mean. So even though your materials list is a list, like with bullet points, you need to make sure that someone else reading it could understand. You also need to make sure that you include things like the workspace needed, technology, paper and pencils, measuring equipment, cups or bowls, and anything else that you might need. Sometimes it helps to imagine acting out the experiment to figure out what you need. Let's go over a couple of those things that are important to include. Let's start with workspace. So when I say include the workspace that you need, I mean give your reader a sense of how much space and what kind of space it's going to require to do your experiment. So for example, if you're doing an experiment that involves someone using a jump rope, you would need to include in your materials list an outdoor space with enough room for someone to jump rope safely. If you were doing something like planting seeds, you're going to need to say a space that can be set up for however many days so that your seeds have time to grow. Another one to remember is technology. If you're using something like a stopwatch on your Chromebook or a certain website to record information for you, or even audio recording if you're listening for sounds, you need to make sure to include those technology pieces in your materials list. Another important one that almost everyone needs is paper and pencils, because you're going to need to have some way to take notes during your experiment to write down your data. And then anything like measuring equipment or cups or bowls, especially if you're doing something that involves food, are definitely going to be needed. At this point, we are going to start our work time. So I'm going to give a couple quick directions before you start. When your teacher says to, you're going to move so that you are with your group members and then start writing. You need to make sure everyone writes in their own packet. So even if you are working with a group, you need to make sure that you have your own copy of all of the materials and all of the things that you are writing in case you have to do any part of the experiment by yourself. Your teacher will also be collecting things from you individually, so you need to make sure that you can be responsible for turning in your work, even though it's going to be the same as your group members. This is the screen that your teacher is going to leave up while you are working as a reminder of what you need to bring for the next class. These are also the things that you have to fill out in your notes packet for this week. You need to write a purpose statement that rephrases your testable question that your group has chosen. You need to choose a hypothesis, and you should ideally have the same hypothesis for your whole group, but if you really differ in ideas, that's something that you can discuss with your teacher. And the third thing that you need is an updated materials list. You're also going to need to make sure that you turn in all items according to your teacher's directions, and if you are buying your own supplies, start making a plan of how to get them. Go ahead and pause the video here so that you can start your work time. That's going to be it for this week's lesson. Don't forget to complete your purpose statement, hypothesis, and materials list so that you are ready for our next step. Thank you so much for learning with me, and I'll see you next time.